At some point, I mean, I'm an ex-Bolshevik, and this does two things for me. One, it means that I have a lot to be guilty about. Secondly, it gives me insights into the politics and nature of the modern left, which most people don't have. One of the things that I did when I was still a revolutionary socialist was try and prevent people from exercising freedom of speech and thought. It came naturally to me. It came naturally to me because I believed that what I thought and desired was so good that anybody who disagreed with me must, by their nature, be evil and be deserving of being silenced. And this is the problem. The general left-wing belief, which is held by the elites of most Western countries now, is also a belief in their own virtue. And if you believe very strongly in your own virtue, and your virtue is based, it's almost a caricature of justification by faith alone. You are a good person because you hold certain opinions. Therefore, if you hold other opinions, you're a bad person. And I think that makes dialogue pretty much impossible. If you think your opponent is bad, not just wrong, but bad, why should you listen to a word he says? Well, they don't.
Well, why is it then that we can't learn the lessons of history? It's not as if it's so very... You lived in Soviet Russia for a long time. You saw the outcomes of that sort of elitist view.
The left have learned the lessons of history to this extent. They understand that the Bolshevik attempt failed, that the Soviet experiment was a disaster. That hasn't cured them of wanting to create paradise on earth. They've just thought, how should we do it another way? Which is how we come to Antonio Gramsci, one of the first and most intelligent communists to understand that the Soviet experiment had failed as long ago as the 1920s. He realized that the civilized working classes of Western Europe were never going to swallow this sort of thing, that there had to be a huge cultural revolution before they ever would. And his ideas took root, particularly in the big Southern European communist parties, his own in Italy, in the final years of the Soviet Empire, and began to spread out beyond the communist parties themselves into the left in general, the ideas of cultural, moral and social revolution, not by violent overthrow, not through dictatorship of the proletariat, not even through seizure or sequestration of industries and banks, but through the capture by the Long March to the institutions of the television studio and the university and the newspaper office and the publishing house and the school, so that after 30 or 40 years of that, you would control pretty much the public mind, and you would be able to get pretty much what you wanted. And it's clever, and you have to concede to these people some admiration for their endless determination, their deep belief in what they want, and their subtle and in many cases very clever organization to achieve it. It's been a very, very well exercised revolution, and they have learned from history. The one thing they haven't learned, which I wish they would learn, is that they're wrong. But they have learned how to be wrong better, and that is why we have to fear them so much.
So two questions immediately arise for me. Given that the great bulk of people are surprisingly sensible when it comes to not being misled by intelligentsia...
I would completely disagree with that. I think the great bulk of people are incredibly easily misled. I find it over and over again. People I like, people who might write to me one week and say, I really liked what you wrote. The next week will be sprouting some drivel about the Russian menace or whatever fashionable nonsense happens to have been fed to them by the media they trust. It's extraordinary how gullible people are.
I find that a very challenging thought as somebody from a country where we pride ourselves on our pragmatism and our ability to see through bull dust. We think we do. You've been to Australia quite a bit.
One of the great things about thinking that you see through it is that people who think that and who pride themselves on it are often the most fantastically gullible people of all.
Well, it's an interesting...
It takes some nerve not to run with the crowd. I mean, I'm not given particularly to self-praise. I know my faults better than most people. And thanks to an awful lot of YouTube, I also know what I look like. Vanity is difficult in my position. But one thing I will say is that I have, maybe it's an instinct I've had since childhood, probably a gift not given to me, not a thing that I can claim any credit for, but I will not run with crowds. But most people will, and they do, and they're happier that way.
Well, there's a point Jordan Peterson makes to his classes in Canada, He points out to people that statistically speaking, they might say that they would not have joined the Hitler Youth, but statistically speaking, they would have.
Yeah.
We would have. I would have, probably. But it does still concern me, particularly in my own country.
That you look at the were people who didn't. I mean,
very few.
Joachim Fest, I think, read this book called Not Me, mainly about his father saying, "I'm not having this," but it was extremely hard not to do. And most people did it, and just as most people wouldn't have been in the French Resistance if they'd been in France in 1942, they just wouldn't have done it.
Anyway, that was part one, as a sort of plea on behalf of people in the street. They need to be more conscious of what's happening. But the second part that I wanted to drill into there is, you're very, very bright people, at least we think we have, we taxpayers in universities. Why are there not more academics? If wisdom is the ability to understand consequences and courage is the ability to point them out, why are there not more academics pushing back against some of these ideas which have proven not just disastrous in practice, but as you point out, in theory as well? They don't work in theory. Communism doesn't work in theory either.
Hang on a minute. We'll move on to communism in a minute, if I may, but you said that one of the quality you're looking for is an ability to understand consequences. You mustn't assume that academics are so selfless that the ultimate consequences of society, perhaps after they're dead, are more important to them than the immediate consequences for their careers. But if I were an academic, I think I would know, indeed, or if I were in broadcasting, I think I would know pretty quickly that if I didn't fit in with the general conformist view of these matters, then I couldn't expect to get tenure or to rise in my profession. And these things are ultimately possibly more important to people than the total coherence or indeed the ultimate consequences of the points of view they espouse. Anyway, anybody can fool himself into believing that his own position is going to lead to paradise. People do that all the time.
So perhaps G.K. Chesterton was right.
About what in this case?
Chesterton and the others who have said similar things then perhaps were right. Stop believing in God and you'll believe in anything.
Well, that's also true, but some people are, in fact, many people, it seems to me, are repelled by the consequences of believing in God. They examine it, and the implications of living in a created universe with a purpose are frightening and often don't suit people's desire for pleasures. I point out in my book, The Rage Against God, a lengthy quotation from Somerset Maugham's autobiographical novel of Human Bondage, where Philip Carey describes with extraordinary frankness the moment at which he decides not to believe in God anymore, and the personal liberation which he associates with this is very strong. He's freed from all kinds of obligations and fears which he previously had. If it was simply a matter of choosing one or the other, and there were no other implications, I think a lot of people would choose it. And it's not surprising to me. Actually, if people weren't brought up, as they are not now, if people aren't brought up to believe in the rather complicated concepts of the Christian religion, they're much more likely to fall into the far more convenient and more easily understood religion of selfism, as I describe it, of doing pretty much what suits you and being sovereign over your own body, which is what a lot of people now desire. Why wouldn't they?
You use the term selfism, and I think back to your time in Australia on Q&A, when a couple of times you put your views only to be sneered at. Yeah. And it struck me at that time that there's a remarkable capacity on the part of some people now to be unbelievably censorious at the same time as they want to say, don't tell us what to do. They want to tell everybody else to do. They retain that right for themselves, but they'll get an instant cheer, as one of your fellow panel members did that night, when he insists that you can't tell us what to do with our bodies.
Yes. Well, I think that's, you oughtn't to seek necessarily consistency in most people's thought, and most people are terribly inconsistent anyway, and there certainly isn't an obvious consistency in this. The causes which they adopt and the things for which they demand protection from criticism all have a specific characteristic, is that they're hostile to the particularly former Protestant Christian societies, I think, It's, every cause which they espouse is one which isn't really compatible with one of theirs, and they then, very cunningly, it's a sort of verbal judo where they use the strength of their opponents against them. They provoke, and this has been particularly important in the issue of homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and all the rest of it. They provoke conservatives into attacking this idea, so that they can then portray those conservatives as bigots who wish to make other people miserable. And that's one of the reasons why conservatives have lost that fight over and over again, and why, looking back on it, I wish I hadn't taken part in it, because it was and remains a very trivial side issue. And whether, 10, 20,000 homosexuals can or cannot get married really isn't particularly important, given the almost total collapse of tens of millions of heterosexual marriages encouraged by state policy, which has been the real issue, the really important moral issue of Western societies over the past 50 years.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there, and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.